You can define the bars.
Now,
what do they do with the radioactive steam coming from that?
it also is recondensed and then returned to the core.
Well, then what's the problem?
That if you have a leak there, it's either replace the coolant or game over. You're one level closer to disaster because you have one less layer of redundancy. Yeah, I mean, that is actually like, you've got to keep adding water. Unless you're Chernobyl, in which case,
How big would that be, though? How big would that setup be? Like,
it's actually bigger because you have to contain the electricity generation too. This containment structure only holds the core. The power plant is outside containment. Here you've got a power plant in the containment. Or at least some percentage of it. Okay. So did we start any?
we like finished it.
We talked about 3 Mile Island already.
Yeah. We were just last week.
So let's go blow up Chernobyl. As everybody understands, this is a more simple system, and so that's the unfortunate, scary problem. That with only one heat exchange system, when the coolant supply runs out, then you get too much heat, and they couldn't control it in time. This was the largest nuclear disaster ever, but I sort of hesitate to compare it with Hiroshima for a few reasons. Yeah, I mean, okay, let me be really clear, I guess, what I mean about this. You can see in the slide 100 times the radioactivity of Hiroshima. Hiroshima?
Yeah.
America. Is it really Hiroshima?
Hiroshima. How long have you been saying that?
The Japanese person told me it's pronounced Hiroshima.
So, like,
Like, I don't know, I'm just asking. Like, I'm not trying to be right. I'm not trying to say I'm right, I'm trying to be right.
All the documentaries say Hiroshima.
yeah, all the documentaries are. Yeah, let's just get it all like.
So here we go. So who cares? It's just Japan. If anybody else wants to pronounce this, please tell me because actually I care. But I don't like to compare these two. The radioactivity released at Hiroshima was apparently significantly less than the radioactivity released from Chernobyl. That said, Chernobyl was an accidental release of radioactivity, and the big impact there was the fallout. One thing that makes it hard to compare the harm is in Hiroshima, the nuclear principle was weaponized, and so in Hiroshima, the bomb was really deadly as a concussive bomb. Like, most of the immediate death toll in Hiroshima was the bomb part, the concussive energy, the resulting fire, and the mayhem and chaos caused by a large explosion, buildings falling and people burning and stuff. It's a large concussive moment. The funny thing about a nuclear bomb is it's still just a really big way to make a bomb. It's a concussive force.
Yeah, it's like the same bomb as the atom.
And so the radioactive fallout issue was sort of secondary to the harm of Hiroshima. It was another problem. And a funny thing about nuclear bombs, in order to maximize the explosion, they explode before they about what fallout is. Fallout is a particulate which carries radioactivity. For example, if you take a cigarette and you light it on fire, much of that material will vaporize. The water and many of the chemicals will go into a vapor form. You either inhale them or they go up into the air. And what you're left with is ashes, which weigh very, very little compared to the weight of a cigarette. Those ashes, if they were produced in the presence of radioactivity, would hold extra subatomic particles like neutrons and then other types of radioactivity. As those neutrons are released from the ash, they give off the different radioactive energies, and that's the problem. The ash fallout, when you have ash in the presence of radioactivity, can travel. The scary thing about fallout is it's not like the radioactivity reached you from the bomb. The radioactivity took a ride on this piece of ash through the atmosphere, and then when that ash enters your water, food stream, body, your blankets, whatever, then that radioactivity has piggybacked on the fallout particulate and done harm later. Funny thing about Hiroshima is that the bomb was horrendously deadly, and then radioactivity was a separate problem later. But Chernobyl had much more radioactivity, and it traveled better because Chernobyl had a ton of fallout. Like, all the stuff that's missing from that big hole turned into ash.
Is that what it looks like?
I mean, not right now, but that's what it looked like
all of like
about a month after.
And the other city just completely.
I know that this photograph is in really low resolution. I'm sure you understand that they didn't take a lot of pictures because this was behind the quote-unquote Iron Curtain.
So who wanted that push?
Plus, this photograph was taken kind of like at a really critical bad news moment, like 7 days after the disaster. Yeah.
You can go there now, but you have to like sign away your life.
No.
If you get cancer, if you die from radioactivity, like there's nothing.
Kind of, but not really. And I can talk about that.
And I saw that in Tokyo they pronounce it Hiroshima, but the locals pronounce it Hiroshima.
Thank you for
I found out that actually Japanese pronounces things with no stress accent on anything, so it's just like Hiroshima.
Okay.
Let's just call it simple.
Yeah.
Both of them are wrong.
All of your interesting side trips are costing us time, and I'm tempted to follow you, but I have to stay on track to set this right.
Yeah.
One thing that's difficult to see in this photograph, you can see that all the windows blew out, and you can imagine that what used to be a very large rectangular building fell in and melted. But in this photograph, it's tough to see this stuff. Those are giant piles of sand and ash. Helicopters were used to drop sand onto the burning reactor as a way to put out flames, because in a traditional fire, you want to smother it to limit the flow of oxygen so that the combustion will end. A big problem is, when a reactor melts, it melts at an exceptionally high temperature. We're talking astronomically high temperatures. So you have this molten reactor that was effectively melting its way into the earth. If you drop a hot ember on a sheet of paper, it'll burn for a second and fall through. And then it'll burn on the next piece of paper and fall through. The reactor had many stories of containment underneath it, and as the stuff melted, it's actually called core lava. As the core lava got super hot, it would just melt more concrete and then fall to the next floor, and then melt more concrete. So it got really, really, really hot. And because you have so much hot air rising, when the helicopter would try to drop dirt over the reactor, the rising hot air would deflect the chopper. So every time they tried to drop sand, they missed. In this image, it's hard for you to see, I think, but this is where the reactor was. That all melted. It started to lava into the ground. What used to be a biological containment shield melted and fell into. That also turned to ashes. But this is one of the many piles of dirt that missed. And as you had more melting and more collapse, you had this continual supply of fallout. One of the things we learned from Chernobyl is that became the deadliest consequence. Because remember, the radioactivity is bad enough, but all things considered, it doesn't travel that far. If there was a radioactive event in Ventura, that radioactivity wouldn't reach us. But if there was wind flying this way, the fallout could very easily, and then deliver the radioactivity to us. Like a couple of kids have said, there's this thing called the exclusion zone, where there was such a consistent blanket of ash that humans will never be allowed to return. The Ukrainian government does permit very limited entrance to what's called Exclusion Zone 1. And yes, you do have to sign a waiver. But on top of that, you have to convince the government that you have a compelling reason to go. You and I are never allowed. The people who can are not adventure tourists, as in that new movie that's Chernobyl Diaries. Adventure tourism is not allowed.
Ghost hunters went.
It does look pretty scary. I saw the preview yesterday.
It's a terrible movie.
You saw it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. The only people who are allowed into the exclusion zone are a very narrow spectrum of professionals, medical and scientific expeditions that are sanctioned by the Ukrainian government. Everywhere else in that zone, nobody will go. Interestingly, a lot of people sneak in.
There it is.
Well, maybe, but apparently they're also hungry because the Ukraine kind of is a place to be hungry.
I think.
And, well, crazy idea. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone 1 is now one of the most lush wilderness parks on Earth. Because that Exclusion Zone 1 hasn't had humans for what, like 30 odd years? 86? 36 years? 26 years? So that's a long time without humans. That's a few generations of like deer and hogs and edible stuff. And so most of the genetic strains that were especially susceptible to radiation have probably died. Everything left is probably radioactive a little bit. But surprisingly, much of that radioactivity has now become ecologically contained. So it's in certain species more than others, and if you're not connected to them in the food web, they don't necessarily reach all species in the food web equally. Mushrooms, fish, and berries all aggregate radioactive isotopes, so those things are really hot and you don't want to eat them. There aren't a lot of fish-eating birds there because they all die when they eat the fish. And there aren't a lot of mammals that eat berries because they all die when they eat the berries. But coincidentally, if you happen to be one of these parts of the food chain which is sheltered from these radioactivity aggregators with no humans around, Exclusion Zone 1 is a really